Professor Hyman Russell Botman, Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, Professor Julian Smith, Vice Rector of Stellenbosch University, faculty members, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow graduates. It is my great pleasure and honor to return to Stellenbosch University a few months after I was invited to deliver a speech on the topic of the place of Africa in the 21st century. During that visit, I emphasized that Stellenbosch University was a world-class university. Since then, I have come to be associated with the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa, SIGLA, at Stellenbosch. I am confident that SIGLA, under the leadership of Stellenbosch University, is destined to make a major contribution in the area of security, leadership, and governance in Africa. In my view, the security, leadership, and governance nexus in Africa is conditio sine qua non for socio-economic development and an essential precondition for Africa to gain its rightful place in the 21st century. Today, I am back to Stellenbosch to receive a doctorate honoris causa degree from this outstanding university. It is my singular honor and privilege to thank the leadership of this university for awarding me this doctorate honoris causa. Over the past years, I have been awarded a number of honorary degrees from various universities within and outside the continent. But I must admit, I am particularly touched by the gesture of Stellenbosch University to award me this honorable degree because, besides its high quality of education, this university represents an outstanding example of the extraordinarily positive transformation of the South African society towards equality and respect for human rights. On a lighter note, however, I hope this gesture is not an unsolicited incentive for my accepting to be the first patron of SIGLA at Stellenbosch. Let me take this opportunity to reiterate my commitment to do my best towards meeting the expectation of this university. I am proud that I was exceptionally requested by Professor Botman to be a guest speaker at this final ceremony, where I am also receiving my honorary doctorate. In this regard, I am reminded that there is so much going on in Africa on the political front that calls for mediation, conflict prevention, and post-conflict reconstruction and development. Therefore, I think it may be pertinent for me to briefly share with the audience, and in particular fellow graduates, some of my own experiences in mediation processes in Africa. I am happy to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, in my view, the process of mediation is often defined by the nature of the conflict and the claims and/or counterclaims of the parties in conflict. While the established principles and rules of engagement in mediation may be the same, it is my considered view, based on my own experience, that the approach to mediation, by and large, depends on the nature of the conflict and the mediator's understanding of the scope of the conflict, as well as the intrinsic variables that determine the dynamics of the conflict. There are principles and modalities for mediation, but at the same time, the notion of one shoe fits all does not always apply. We all know that there are generally two types of conflict, normally categorized as intrastate and interstate conflicts. In other words, conflict within states and conflict between states or among states. These two categories have their own dynamics and require specific approaches. Normally, the intrastate conflicts are as a result of contestation by political groups and other entities within a country. The major sources of such conflicts have been ethnicity, religious fundamentalism, irredentism, as well as social and economic inequalities. Another source is contestation of a leadership and governance and secessionism, like it was in Katanga in Congo in the 60s, Biafra in Nigeria, and today what we can witness in Mombasa in Kenya. These categories of conflicts were prevalent in the 60s and 70s, and the mediation process required a structured dialogue, either between two ethnic groups or the two contesting political groups. This was the experiences in many of our countries, including my own country, the Republic of Mozambique. Almost invariably, in all conflicts among their root causes, we find those emanating from distant historical rivalries among population groups and from colonial practices. We find also the external causes related to interests of foreign states or companies, particularly during the Cold War period. It is important to point out that in a society, there are other types of conflicts, which I would like to classify as social conflicts and economic conflicts. The social conflicts range from the individual conflicts, which concern the conflict of the person with himself, or said in another way, which concerns people who do not live in peace with themselves, to the conflicts between an individual and other individuals. This may refer to conflicts within a family or a community. The other type of conflicts refers to what commonly is called industrial conflicts, which can occur between employees and employers, between workers' unions, or between companies or partners within a company. All these social conflicts can escalate from one level to another and become conflicts of national dimensions. On the other hand, all of them can be resolved by a process of mediation, besides the other processes of facilitation or the use of legal instruments. Of course, we cannot speak of mediation or use of legal instruments when it comes to intimate conflict of an individual with himself. But here, there is room for counseling, particularly when the causes of such personal conflict can be determined. The second category is the conflicts between states or interstate conflicts. The source of these conflicts have continued to be contestation over boundaries between countries. Africa has accumulated a wealth of experiences in conflict mediation between states. The earlier conflicts of this nature included Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, and Djibouti. While generally there is a significant decline in interstate conflict as a result of changes in political and economic landscapes in Africa, there is, however, a resurgence of intra-state conflicts, such as the conflict in Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, and Madagascar. The African Union has initiated some mediation efforts to help resolve the conflicts in these countries. With respect to interstate conflicts, there are currently 48 disputes between recognized sovereign states in Africa. I would like to limit my speech to my own mediation experiences on the ground and share with you my own observations and some recommendations. The first experience I had in the mediation was the mediation of an interstate conflict in my own country. You would recall that immediately after the War for Liberation and Independence, my country was involved in the War of Destabilization. This war killed about 1 million people, caused a massive displacement of about 4.5 million people, 1/3 of whom as refugees in the neighboring countries, and 2/3 as internally displaced. The social tissue was torn apart, and the productive capacity of the country was undermined. The war destroyed most of the country's infrastructure, including railways, roads, bridges, power stations, power lines, schools, hospitals, and many others. The government had two options: to continue to fight those who were involved in the war of destabilization, or to negotiate for peace, with the aim of putting an end to the destruction and the deep human suffering. That peace would be a first step for the social and economic development. The government opted for the rational choice of seeking for mediation, and one can categorically say that mediation is a useful and desirable option in conflict resolution. The war of destabilization was mentored and fueled by the minority racist and apartheid regimes of Rhodesia and South Africa. Therefore, it was necessary to find ways to minimize the role of the external conflict before we could concentrate in what became an internal conflict. And here again, we had recourse to mediation and negotiation. You might recall the Nkomati Accord. To deal with this internal conflict and to minimize the external interference, we had to create conditions for a dialogue through vast political and economic reforms, including a profound revision of the Constitution. This process of reforms took several years. Only then we could request some African leaders accepted by both sides to mediate. Later on, a new group of mediators was established, comprising a representative of Mozambican religious leaders, a representative of a religious-oriented organization from Italy, and a representative of the Italian government. This group also had the trust of the two sides. The negotiations between the government of Mozambique delegation and the delegation of the rebel movement lasted more than 2 years, but those negotiations were successful, culminating with the signing of a general peace agreement. The implementation of the peace agreement was supported by the international community, but the main reason of its success and sustainability of peace in the country was the goodwill and determination of the two conflicting parties. I am happy to note that my decision to opt for mediation is appreciated by both my own people and the international community, as demonstrated by the many awards I have been receiving from all corners of the world, including the Prime Minister of Italy's Fanfani's Together for Peace Award, the Chatham House Prize for the most significant contribution to the improvement of international relations, the first Mo Ibrahim Prize for excellence in leadership and credit for bringing peace to Mozambique. It is because I was sure that peace had come to stay in my country that a few years after completing the essential part of the post-conflict national reconstruction and securing the political stability of the country, I decided to relinquish power by my free will, in spite of the fact that I had the possibility to run for another term of 5 years. Since I left the office of Head of State in 2005, I have been called upon by either the United Nations and African Union or the Southern Africa Development Community to mediate in various conflicts in Africa. I have been mediating in Guinea-Bissau, in Uganda, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Madagascar, in Kenya, and in Malawi. Besides participating in the collective mediation within the organs of the Organization of African Unity when I was still in government, I was invited to participate in the mediation process led by the late Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and later by President Nelson Mandela, followed by President Jacob Zuma in the Burundian conflict. In all these cases of intra-state conflicts, I noticed that one of the most difficult aspects is how to build up the minimum mutual confidence among the parties in conflict. The other difficulty is to assure that there is no relapse to the conflict once implementation of the agreement starts. Also, I have learned that it is important to involve other stakeholders of the society who are not directly parts of the conflict, such as scholars, women, youth, media, unions, religious leaders, among other civil society organizations. In some cases, like in Guinea-Bissau and Madagascar, the armed forces had to be consulted and encouraged to take a position conducive to peace. An important aspect of the mediation process is the necessity of making the parties and the public in general to understand that a mediator is neither a judge nor a referee. His role is not to determine who is right and who is wrong, but instead to lead the parties to give concessions to one another and build a consensual solution to their conflict. Lately, the African Forum for Former Heads of State and Government, which I chair, was requested to mediate in the boundary dispute currently between the United Republic of Tanzania and the Republic of Malawi over Lake Nyasa or Lake Malawi. President Festus Mogae, former head of state of Botswana, President Thabo Mbeki, former head of state of South Africa, and I represented the forum in the mediation process, and we will consult the other members whenever it becomes necessary. I see this request by both Malawi and Tanzania as another example of a growing trust of the countries of SADC in using own resources to strengthen peace and stability in our region. Invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me now share some of my own experience in the mediation process in Africa. Yeah. My overall experience is limited to intrastate conflicts, as I said, and not so much in interstate conflicts. However, in general, my own experience as a mediator, I would argue, is relevant to both intrastate and interstate conflicts. In the early 60s and 70s, conflict mediation in Africa was within the framework of the Organization of African Unity, assigned to elder statesmen in Africa. This was the case of Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Ahmed Bembela from Algeria, and Ahmed Sékou Touré from Guinea. These elder statesmen were considered as eminent persons, and they were on ad hoc basis called upon to mediate in interstate conflict generally, involving boundary dispute in Africa. They were guided in their mediation efforts by three key principles. First, respect for the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of member states, as well as peaceful settlement of conflicts. Second, they were also guided by the principles and values of the Charter of the Organization of African Unity. Additionally, the elder statesmen and the parties in conflict were required to accept unconditionally the principle of try the OAU first principle. In other words, the parties could approach other institutions outside the Organization of African Unity, but they were required to go to the OAU first. The third major requirement was respect for the principle of the sanctity of inherited boundaries adopted by the OAU in Cairo in 1964. This was essentially due to the prevalence of boundary disputes immediately in the post-independence period. The principle of the sanctity of inherited boundaries has remained, by and large, the guiding principle in mediation process. There was also the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs of member states. However, with the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, the principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of member states has been replaced by a new principle, namely the principle of the responsibility to protect. We can therefore suggest that mediation efforts in Africa have so far taken the form of ad hoc deployment of special envoys, currently referred to as mediators. Consequently, a number of heads of state and government, including former heads of state and government, have been deployed either by the United Nations, the African Union, or regional economic communities to undertake mediation missions. My own experience tells me that the ad hoc deployment of mediators has become a norm rather than exception to the rule. As Africa prepares to claim the 21st century as an African century, there is the need to move from ad hoc to more structured and more sustainable mediation processes. There is no doubt that over the years, the need for well-established and systematic mediation intervention is an imperative necessity for both the African Union and the regional economic communities. According to Oxfam International findings published in 2007, the cost of conflicts on Africa's development between 1990 and 2005 was approximately 300 billion US dollars. The study, titled Africa's Missing Billion, shows that the African continent loses an average of 18 billion US dollars a year due to armed conflicts. This is a clear demonstration of the imperative need for peaceful conflict resolution through mediation, particularly in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, invited guests, I would now like to talk about a number of issues that, in my view, need to be addressed. The first is about the role of the African Union in mediation. The African Union needs to strengthen its mediation capacity in a structured manner. At the moment, the concept of elders in mediation is still recognized, but essentially on ad hoc basis. Fortunately, with the changing political landscape in Africa and the entrenchment of democracy, we now have a pool of former heads of state and government who constitute a major moral force which is so important in mediation process. They are depositories of a vast individual and collective experience gathered from their exposure to and participation in many debates, both in national and in multilateral institutions, where collective mediation has been practiced. We may recall here the long discussions in the summits of the OAU of the conflicts between Ethiopia and Somalia. It is upon the African Union and the RECs to make use of this major source. At the same time, it is important to work on more effective and efficient modalities for selecting and deploying a mediator or group of mediators to assist countries in need. Secondly, there is the imperative need for a more effective coordination between the African Union and the regional economic communities, as well as the United Nations as appropriate. These would avoid duplication of efforts and resources. A proliferation of mediators in a country may undermine the possibility of an earlier resolution. In a particular conflict, the deployment of joint envoys or mediators might help to avoid both duplication of efforts or resources. Effective coordination provides clarity in mandate and operational modalities. It improves efficiency and efficacy in mediation. It allows for the application of the principles of subsidiarity. To this end, it is imperative to strengthen coordination between the African Union and the RECs, as well as the United Nations in mediation processes in Africa. If my experience is anything to go by, there are often a number of eminent persons in the mediation process representing different institutions without clearly defining roles. Without clearly defined roles. This creates confusion and sometimes may undermine the mediation process. It is not advisable to have a series of mediators in one conflict representing different institutions. The third aspect that we need to consider is the funding for mediation processes. Often there are no financial resources within the African Union or the regional economic communities to sustain mediation process. Sometimes funds are sourced from outside Africa, and often the notion of who pays the piper calls the tune undermines the abilities to mediate and the objectiveness of the mediation process. In my view, funding plays a critical role in the mediation process. My view is that it would be advisable to ensure that funds are available on regular and predictable basis. Currently, funding for the African Union's mediation efforts continue to be raised on a case-by-case basis and are often supported by external donors, partners, foreign governments, and multilateral institutions. Thus, although an appointed special envoy may lead the African Union's mediation effort, there is often a perception that funding partners are running the show. It was noted that an example of this incongruity was the African Union's intervention in Sudan, which was the new African Union's first prominent intervention after the formation of its Peace and Security Council. Fourth issue has to deal with the capacity for and support to mediation processes. It is important to ensure that the designated mediators have the necessary logistical and technical support to carry out their responsibilities. It is not enough to simply identify a mediator without providing him or her with the necessary technical and logistical support. The key element of mediation process is analytical and interpretation capacities of policies and legal instruments. It is therefore imperative for mediators to be provided with the necessary technical capacity to ensure efficacy and efficiency of the mediation process. It is clear that we need to strengthen our management, administrative, and financial capacity for supporting mediation process. We also need to improve the capacity to provide analysis on the conflict to be mediated. Perhaps the most challenging is the development of a roadmap acceptable to all. This depends very much on the definition of the mandate of the mediator and the capacity for monitoring and evaluation. This normally requires the establishment of a liaison office. In my view, it is important to avoid procedural and administrative capacity problems in mediation process. Too often, the problem of capacity arises when mediation efforts are headed by country or international organization providing funds and experts on a specific amount and only for a short period. In such situations, when the funding countries withdraw their experts or funding, the mediator is left with no resources or capacity to continue the mediation process. The fifth and final point has to do with post-resolution activities. The experience on the ground is that the mediator may be successful in elaborating and eventually lead the parties to signing agreements, but the common trend is that the mediation ends with the signing of the agreement. Experience on the ground shows there is an imperative need to follow up and implementing some post-resolution activities to ensure sustainability and durability of the content of the agreement. The final aspect I would like to allude to is time frames. Quite often, there is a tendency of establishing tight time frames due to budgetary limitation. These pressures may miss the important issue of negative feelings always present in a conflict, such as suspicion, mistrust, and even hatred among the conflicting parties. These feelings, which hamper sober and reasoning, need to be dealt with before meaningful negotiations can take place and agreements reached. If these negative sentiments are not brought to law levels or even resolved, they risk being the sources of relapse of the conflicts. Members of the faculty, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, in my speech today, I have focused more on the practical aspects of mediation based on my own experiences on the ground. I have not, therefore, addressed the theoretical aspects of mediation, which normally are the preoccupation of the academia. As I stated earlier, there are established general principles of mediation, but the specific approach may vary from case to case. What I have outlined in this presentation are the common and necessary elements for successful mediation process. I will leave it to the academic and indeed to universities and the academia to address the theoretical underpinning of the theories of mediation and stages in mediation process and their challenges in Africa. My plea is that the African Union and regional economic communities must ensure that there are sufficient funds, expertise, and logistical support on a regular and predictable basis throughout the mediation process. I thank you very much for your attention.